Hi, I'm Adam Francescudo, and this is my debate presentation for Political Science 3365. Today, many developing countries are faced with massive amounts of external debt that is increasingly more difficult to pay off. This debate will look at the arguments for and against the cancellation of this debt. The ongoing developing debt issue began around the 1960s when former colonized nations gained their independence. These states required external financial support to build up the social and economic infrastructure needed in sustaining their own country. The International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and other private financial institutions offered large loans to these countries. Throughout the 1970s, the oil crisis pushed oil prices and inflation through the roof, leading global central bankers to increase interest rates throughout the 1980s. These macroeconomic conditions made it harder for the newly independent countries in the global south to pay off their debts for a few reasons. First, rising interest rates simply meant that they had to pay more interest for the loans they were taking out. Second, as the debt is mainly denominated in US dollars, the rising interest rates in the US led to the appreciation of the US dollar, making the debt harder to pay off for developing countries that were using their own depreciating currencies. And thirdly, rising oil prices and inflation made it more expensive to offer goods and services to their citizens, and in many cases, these countries are forced to decide between making interest payments on a ballooning debt or offering health and social services. The first argument for the cancellation of developing debt is that it would enable these countries to allocate more money to social services like health and education, rather than increasing interest payments to financial institutions in the developed world. This would, without a doubt, lead to decreasing poverty rates, an increase in life expectancy, and overall healthier quality of life. The chart on the right demonstrates this massive problem, with a much larger portion of government budgets in various developing countries going to debt payments than social spending. The second argument for the cancellation of debt is that it is not fair to have the citizens of developing countries suffer for the loans that were made to former corrupt dictators. Under international law, odious debt should be cancelled to free citizens from the chains of the selfish dictatorial decisions from the past. Many of these loans to corrupt regimes were made during the Cold War, as Western powers sought to increase their influence around the world. Pictured in the bottom left is President Ronald Reagan shaking hands with former President Mobutu of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who received loans from the IMF and World Bank to ensure that Congo aligned with the West during the Cold War. Locals did not see much of this money and are suffering today to pay it back. Picture on the bottom right is Leonce Ndickoman's book, which attacked the arguments made by developed countries that Africa has been draining their resources in terms of aid and loans, by showing how in reality more money has been leaving the continent through debt financing of these odious loans than they have been receiving. He points out that over half of these loans made to African governments end up in private bank accounts in the developed world, which, within the same year, many of which are the same banks that provided the loans, and leaving the public to pay for the private foreign assets of these leaders. On the other hand, many developed countries argue that the cancellation of debt on the grounds of the rise of moral hazard. It is feared that if the debt of developing countries is cancelled, then those leaders will become reckless in their spending, knowing that a future bailout is possible. A second argument against the cancellation of developing debt is that it would threaten the stability of the global financial system. If financial institutions wrote off the debt owed to them by developing nations, it is worried that this would cause some banks to collapse, thus leading to another global financial crisis. This list shows the globally systematically important banks, many of which would be largely affected by the cancellation of developing debt, thus putting the stability of the global financial system in question. Lastly, it is argued by the developed countries that there is no guarantee that developing leaders would spend the money saved from debt payments on healthcare and education. It is very possible that these leaders would instead spend their money on military spending or vanity projects that would have little long-term social benefits, such as the Brazilian Olympic infrastructure. Despite all these arguments against debt cancellation, in the late 1990s, the international community acknowledged that the developing debt crisis was a structural and not economic problem, and that something needed to change or else these states threatened the failure. In 1996, the G8 signed the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative, which set the framework to allow eligible countries to receive debt relief. In 2005, the G8 then created the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, which proposed that the IMF, World Bank, and African Development Fund offer 100% debt cancellation to those countries that reach the completion point of the HIPC initiative. As of 2016, over $100 billion of debt relief has been provided to 38 developing countries. However, although this seems like a promising achievement, many criticize these initiatives as they do not include private debt, which makes up a large portion of many countries' total external debt, and they are tied to strict conditionalities that are similar to the structural adjustments that were tied to the original loans. As this quote points out, international financial institutions have become the new form of dictatorship, ruling over developing countries through debt and conditionalities. These conditionalities attached to the debt relief only further plays into this system, creating a never-ending spiral. It is unknown whether or not developing countries will ever break free from the chains of debt.